Okay, so this is my first clip in a series that I'm calling, what am I calling this thing? Geopolitics and the Balance of Payments. Okay, so I'm making this, I think, what is today? Let me just check here. September 24th, 2008. So I'm making this. So at this point, we've sort of touched upon some key issues in class and in my PowerPoint slides. And those issues being that I talked about central banks. I talked about how central banks own assets, and one of those important assets being foreign exchange reserves. So this would be like saying this Canadian central bank owning US dollars. Remember, the phrase foreign exchange just means the foreign currency. Okay, and as you will recall, in many of my examples I use the Japanese yen as that sort of playing that role. I also, as you know, and we discussed for quite a while, was that issue about tariffs versus quotas, quotas, and the free trade scenario, right? The tariffs, the quotas, and the free trade scenario. We talked about, you must remember that graph, right, with the those different shaded areas, like 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, okay. And so we talked about that, as you must remember, right, when we shifted the price above the world price level and create different distortions, basically shifting production to domestic producers and shifting production away from the foreign producers. In other words, we're going to import less and produce more domestically, and consumers end up paying higher prices. So remember, we talked about that. And the other thing I talked about, of course, was the balance of payments. And I presented it to you in sort of the traditional way that I was taught it when I was a student, and I used the same method with you, as basically a big gigantic accounting system that looks at transactions that occur between countries. In other words, international transactions, business transactions. And just to quickly recap, remember we talked about the current account, the capital account, and the official financing account. Right? Inside the current account, we had some key things like merchandise exports and merchandise imports we would measure, and service exports and service imports. And there was also the income that you earned on assets that are in another country. So this would be like if a Canadian owns a factory in the United States, and that company down there makes profit and sends that income back to the Canadian. That would show up as an international transaction. Then, of course, just briefly, the capital account, again, refers to those things like short-term investments in capital, short-term capital investments. And then we talked about long-term capital investments, the two main types being portfolio investments, when portfolio investment means buying stocks and bonds that are issued by foreigners, right? So this could be like Canadians buying German government bonds, or something like a French investor buying part of a Canadian company. Let's say like the Royal Bank of Canada. So it's international buying and selling of stocks and bonds. And of course the real big one was the foreign direct investment, when you're actually taking controlling interests of companies, factories that are located in a foreign country. And then, of course, the official financing account, which looks at transactions that the central bank engages in which it is buying and selling of foreign exchange, that foreign currency. Okay, so that's just the quick recap. Now, what I've done is pretty much standard issue. I mean, there's nothing too out in left field, so to speak. Any business economics major would, say, yep, that's pretty much orthodox presentation. And that's because I used my textbooks to help me make my PowerPoint slides for you. So that's why it's all consistent. But I just wanted to sort of go a little bit out into left field in this clip, and I'll probably make a couple more for this geopolitics and balance of payments, because I want to go and sort of ask the bigger question, sort of like, who cares? Like, why do we care? What's the bigger implications of all of this from a world economic perspective, and more importantly from a world political hegemonic perspective? Now, hegemony basically just means power and influence over other countries, basically, right? So if your country can influence what other countries do all the time, then you're said to have hegemonic influence on that country. And that's where sort of the balance of payments comes in. So what I did, this kind of happened somewhat serendipitously. It's kind of an accident, because I didn't really expect to read this, but I read it and said, oh my goodness, this fits in nicely, because it kind of brings it all together. It kind of brings together our discussion about trade and goods and services, our discussion about free trade versus restrictions or protectionism, so like tariffs and quotas and stuff like that. It also brings in my discussion about the balance of payments, official financing, and it also touches on the issue of fixed exchange rates as well. So it kind of brings those four topics together. Okay, so which is very useful, as opposed to looking at, here's four different sections and a bunch of PowerPoint slides, and you have them as four different ideas. It's helpful to unify them. Anyway, here, let me show you what I got. This book, I'm taking this from this book, and it's in chapter, basically what I'm doing, I'm going to be summarizing chapter 7 in this book, and I'll show it to you here. It's called The Century of War, on Anglo-American Oil Politics and the New World Order by William Engdahl. So I read chapter 7 in his book, just sort of by accident, really, because as you can see from behind me, I have lots of books. So I just flip through them from time to time, and I just happened to stumble across this. And it really touches upon all of these issues. And actually it touches upon even more issues as well that your textbook does cover, and we will eventually cover later on. It talks about things like joint ventures as an international expansion strategy, as opposed to simply just exporting and importing of goods. So joint venture operations. What else does it talk about? Well, we'll see. There's lots of good stuff in here, so that's why I picked it. And so I'll be making this a couple more clips and just covering this chapter 7 in this book. But there really are three main sort of things that he talks about in this book that I'm going to use as real world examples of all of this stuff. The first is this what's called the Bretton Woods arrangement, which came out like 1944, so sort of as World War II is wrapping up. The second thing is Iran in the 1950s. We're going to look at that. And the last thing is the Italy. We're going to look at Italy in the 1950s. So on to clip number 2.